Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and hopefully a friendly crowd. It's kind of cool to have come far enough or along that people actually have heard of us, because when it was me and Stephen and Chris and Daniel in Stephen's basement, certainly nobody had heard of us a few years ago. So Scrumagilean, the word that you couldn't pronounce. Scrumagilean was a joke, and not a very kind joke, of a former boss of mine who, so I used to be head of project management for a very large hospital company, and my boss, when we first started trying to go Agile, do Agile, there were talks about Agile, and there were talks about Lean, and there were talks about Scrum, and on the one hand, the Scrum and Agile stuff, and this was years ago, bear with me here, sounded like a bunch of sort of crazy weirdos. And Lean was this thing people did in manufacturing years ago. And so there was a lot of confusion about what all this stuff meant. And it sounded like, from his perspective, it sounded like it was all kind of the same. But people who were really steeped in this would tell him, no, that's totally wrong. Those other people, they're the stupid long-haired weirdos. We're the people who know everything and are totally right. And so he, as somebody from the outside, came up with this term to describe the weirdness of the various Agile tribes. So I'm here to talk to you a little bit how I think these things go together. Hopefully that'll be useful for you guys. I am not that Jon Terry. I am the CEO of LeanKit. We are, for those who don't know, LeanKit is a visual project management company, a Kanban software tool. We get used for lots of things, from running telenovelas in Brazil to building aircraft engines for Rolls-Royce, to software development, to accounting firms, all kinds of different things. What I want to start off with today is talking about how I view the landscape of Lean, and how there's a lot of different changes going on in the world of management across many, many industries, and how those things fit together, and maybe that would be useful for you. A public service announcement before I do that. For all the infighting within the Agile world or the Lean world, we have to remember that this is actually the enemy. It's still very much out there. Bad people like Gartner are still telling people you can run two-speed IT and that waterfall is perfectly good. That's horribly wrong and criminal negligence as a consulting firm, but it's still out there. So even if we disagree about Scrum or Kanban or Lean or Agile, let's at least remember that this is definitely what we're trying to avoid, because those things on the right, I would say, are true, and they're true no matter how big the type of work we're doing is. So, for those of us in the software development world, this is often what people mean by Agile. So Agile is sort of this container, which is kind of mostly Scrum. Most people would think that way. They're not sure what Kanban is, or whether it's Lean Kanban, or are those the same things, or are they different? There's old people who used to do XP, and there's also still super ninja coders in Scotland who do it. And English people do this DSDM thing, but nobody else has ever heard of it. So that's how a lot of people think about the world of modern management methods when they talk about Agile. That's what they mean. And I want to suggest to you that that is a very, very narrow software developer way of viewing what's going on in the world, and that the changes that are going on in software development are actually going on across many industries all around the world, under different names that, quite frankly, outside of software development usually goes under a bit more of the Lean label. But very similar ideas that work together very well. I am not going to spend a lot of time giving you the history lesson here. I think you guys can all read. But the main thing here is that what we're doing in the world of software development and Agile very much shares a heritage with what people in the world of construction and large engineering firms and marketing teams and Lean startup and all those kinds of things. Very, very similar foundational ideas that are coming to play here and helping all of us. And I don't know, nor do I necessarily care if in the world of software we're going to end up using the word lean to describe it, or if DevOps takes over the whole thing or whatever. The reason I would say that this is potentially useful for you is A, there's a lot of really good learning out there in other industries, and sometimes the best way to take another look at what you do in your space and not just sort of go forward with it with an assumption of what makes sense is taking a step back and learning something about how people do things in a different space. And you will often find strong commonalities, and you'll also find differences that force you to think about why you do the things that you do. That's definitely something that I've experienced as I work with construction firms, hard hat construction firms, and sort of say, oh, well, why do we do that in software development teams? Why don't we do things more like what they do? So I think there's some really useful learnings if you reach beyond the world of sort of just Agile. I also think that if you are not yet in a position where your company has absolutely embraced Agile sort of whole hog at the executive level, sometimes when you're reaching up to the senior executive levels, they will have had more experience or have heard more about Lean. And so it may be sort of a pass key that gets you into conversations that you might not otherwise have gotten into. That was certainly my experience. So, going back to my sort of roots at my old companies, when I talked about Agile for a long time, it was, sure, John, do that. As long software developer, you can do whatever you want in the corner. Just don't bother us with it. When we started talking about Lean, I started getting meetings with very senior executives, and this was for a company of 180,000 people. And so, this sort of unlocked doors that Agile was not opening for me. So, hopefully useful for you. What's really important here is that there are practices that we do in Scrum and Kanban and XP and so on. But the practices should best be viewed as a suggested approach that often works given the right context. And what's really important is to understand the principles that underlie those practices, because if you do that, then when the practices don't work in a particular context, you are much more able to adapt to the new circumstances. Or when you face objections from people who don't get the practice, you're much better prepared to explain why you're doing it, rather than just saying, well, I read it in the Scrum guide, or I read it in David Anderson's book, and so it must be good. So principles help a lot with deep understanding. This is not something you maybe will see in other books. This is sort of the world according to Jon. But what I would say is if you think about all of these modern management methods, Lean, Kanban, Scrum, Agile, et cetera, the way they fundamentally differ from previous management methods and the ways of running companies is in two things. One is about people, and one is about maths. So on the people side, old ways of management, waterfall style management, assumes that people are inherently lazy. They inherently have to be driven with carrots and sticks. And the function of managers is to make people do work that they would not otherwise do if you were not making them do it. Whereas modern management methods assume that people are inherently pretty decent, that if you explain why you're trying to do something and they're excited about that mission, that they want to do good work, they want to be part of something that's accomplishing something good. And so your role as a manager is not carrots and stick, but rather mentorship and vision setting and helping people understand where they're going. Now that's not to be naive. There are bad people out there. There are lazy people in every company, but I would say people are going to live up or down to whatever your governing assumption is for the way people behave. If you assume people are lazy and you treat them that way, they will behave that way. If you assume people are good and decent and hardworking and you allow them to behave that way, the majority of good, decent people will find out the people who aren't without management having to do it for them. So that's, I would say, one fundamental difference in worldview for these ideas. The other one is a difference in belief about mathematics and economics. And that is that old ways of managing, waterfall ways of managing, the way a lot of accounting systems and the way a lot of merit performance systems for companies work is that they assume that we should be aiming for high utilization of resources. They assume that what we should be doing is trying to keep people and equipment busy, and so by doing that, we will have good economics in a company. Whereas lean, agile, and so on, whether they think about it or not, are premised on the idea that an organization should be built around fast flow of value from concept to cash. And then if you work on improving the speed to value, you will actually get high utilization efficiency as a side effect. Whereas if you focus on utilization, you won't ever actually get high speed of flow of value through the organization. So two fundamental sort of deep-rooted differences in these different ideas, which probably seem pretty simple. They kind of seem sort of motherhood and apple pie. Yeah, of course that's the way the world works, but it really is not how most companies are built deep in the roots of their HR practices and their accounting, which is honestly what forces most companies to work the way they work. Digging in a bit deeper, the next level down in terms of what lean is. A couple of different things here. One, there is no canonical list of lean principles. So this is Jon's list, which owes a lot to Mary Poppendike, but not entirely. It's not going to map entirely to different things you're going to see at a Lean Enterprise Institute. It doesn't matter. There's a very high degree of overlap, even if it's not perfect. What I think is useful about the way lean principles are often presented, or should be presented, and what I'm going to try to do here, is that they interlock. They connect to each other in a way that makes each one better and stronger if you're using them, as opposed to what I would suggest is a lot of times there's really good ideas that you will hear if you go to an Agile conference, but it's a bit of a grab bag, and there's not necessarily an underlying logic to how these things fit together and are required to work together to make them truly work, especially when you're talking about an enterprise scale. However, I hope, and I think you will see that as I go through these, there should be nothing that you're going to say, oh, I don't agree with that. That totally conflicts with what I've learned in the Agile world. We'll see how I do. All right, so starting off, lean is maybe first and foremost, and it's certainly the thing most people will know about eliminating waste, which has two different ways that people will often hear that and react to it. One is, well, yeah, eliminating waste, duh. I mean, of course we're going to eliminate waste. And the other side of it is going to be, well, so when you say eliminate waste, what you mean is you're going to lean out the organization, and it's going to be, redundancies and getting rid of people. Neither one of those things is true whatsoever. I'll address the second one first. The second one is honestly the result of Six Sigma consultants attaching themselves to the word lean and coming up with this horrible atrocity of Lean Six Sigma. And using lean as a cover for the terrible things that they like to do in terms of resource utilization efficiency. So one, lean does not mean that whatsoever. What lean does mean on the other side of that in terms of the sort of good part of it is lean is about viewing your company and what it does entirely from the view of your customers, not the view of your shareholders, honestly not the viewpoint starting off of your employees or anything else. It's saying a company exists to serve its customers. And if it doesn't do that consistently and well, it will not survive. So we need to be looking at what we do as a company and saying, if I itemized my bill and presented that bill to my customer, would they look at it and read the line items and say, yep, I'll pay for that, I'll pay for that, I'll pay for that? People will say, well, I don't know, no, nobody wants to pay for things. They're going to say, no, I don't think that's right. I think if you've got a good quality product, people are happy to pay for that. I mean, you think of, lots of companies, Apple and other technology companies that build really good products. People are willing to pay a lot of money for good products. What they aren't willing to pay for is stupidity and waste. So if, to use a very fundamental example, if I'm building sort of lecterns like this one, my customer, if they see a line item for metal, yeah, of course you're going to have to have metal. You're going to have to transport that. You're going to have to pay people to make the thing. You're going to have shipping out to the actual client. But if I've got a big line item around scrap and rework, if I have a big line item around having to store lots of extras because I don't have a very good inventory management system to maintain flow of deliveries, if I have bloated administration, those kinds of things, that's my problem. That's not the customer's problem. And they see that and they're going to recognize that. So that's what we mean at the root when we lean folks talk about eliminating waste. There's 3 categories of waste that we break waste out into in the lean world. The first one, and I'm not a really big user of the Japanese terms in the world of lean, but if you see Japanese terms, you're going to see a word muri, which is the waste of busyness, overburden. And this is the mathematical idea that in any system of sequential flow of activities, the more burdened you are, the busier you are, the longer things take to happen, which is kind of logical. What matters a lot in understanding this is that this isn't linear. This is not a straight line going up 45 degrees to the right. The way this works is initially on about the left 2/3 of this scale, I can get a little busier and not get much slower. But sometime between 60 and 80% utilization in an organization, you start becoming drastically slower with each small amount of busyness. And this matters a lot in the way companies are run because I don't know about you guys, but if you're in a company that uses something like Clarity or Microsoft Project Server, and you've got rules around timesheets that people are supposed to be 100% allocated to projects, mathematically speaking, what you're saying is we want to get nothing done. If you plan to be 100% busy, if your planned work fills 100% of your time, I guarantee that there is unplanned work, which means you get nothing done. So this is not opinion, this is math. To make it a little bit, or actually a lot worse potentially, one of the other lean wastes we talk about is the idea of muro, which is the waste of variability, what in the world of logistics we often call the bullwhip effect. And that is that small amounts of variability in a supply chain, in a value chain, in one spot will cause very large ripple effects up and down the value stream. Things that you in your part of the team think are very small will cause huge problems up and downstream. And so a lean organization will strive very hard to operate with very low variability, smooth flow of value through the system, because even though it means in some ways wasting capacity, what you're ensuring is smooth flow and speed of delivery, which has a value all its own. So the math here, and I deliberately don't have much in the way of numbers, I think you can see it as a picture, is that if I have high variability, I'm not going to be able to achieve as much utilization as if I have low variability. So to think about it in very, to give you a mental picture of how this works out. So imagine a highway. Imagine a highway that's filled with large trucks, or a highway that's filled with Vespas. Which one do you think has the most flexibility and can be filled up the most without slowing down? It's going to be the highway full of Vespas, thus any road you see in India or in Naples. So I mean, basically that's the idea that small batch sizes, reduced variability allows you to fill a system and yet still maintain a high degree of speed versus big lorries, big trucks, the variability in how they start and stop, you can't fill the road nearly as much. So think about that in terms of small batch size for projects versus big batch size projects. That's Mora. The way those tend to come out in the world and we see them is in the waste that most people are familiar with, which go under the term in Japanese lean circles of muda. These are the way you sort of see muri and mura. And these wastes, there are different flavors of these. This is an attempt to sort of translate waste that you would see in the physical lean world into the world of knowledge work. These wastes tend to work in pairs in how they sort of instantiate. So the first one, work in process. Well, wait a second, how can work be waste? Well, customers don't pay for work, they pay for delivery. So ideally, your organization should have as little work happening relative to the amount of value being delivered out the other end. So if you have a high amount of work in process, in essence, that's inventory. That's especially bad in a world of delays. So something that is asked for yesterday and delivered today has a great deal of value. For anybody who's an Amazon customer, we know how that works, right? We pay extra money every year because of exactly that thing. Whereas if something's going to come next week, I'm going to pay less. If something's going to pay in months, I'm going to pay even less. If something is years, I don't even actually believe you I'm ever going to get it, and so I'm going to discount the value extremely. So my goal as an organization should be to have as little work as possible going through the system so that I can deliver things as fast as possible and consequently have a very high sort of value to work in process ratio as I possibly can. Extra features and technical debt. By now, you guys have probably heard various forms of this idea that, unfortunately, for those of us who build software, most of what we build rarely or never gets used in terms of features. There's different numbers out there. Sometimes they range as high as 70%, but even if you just go on the low end of those measurements and say 50% of the features that are built in most software are rarely or never used. The sales team thinks they're fantastically important and we have to get them into the next release, and you go back and do analysis a year later and you find out there's 10 people using the thing. That happens all the time. So we are building all the time things that actually have no value once they go out into the world. That problem is exacerbated dramatically by the fact that if you think about the way we run most projects in IT organizations, we're strongly focused on project cost and not on product lifecycle cost. Even though the time and cost we spend in the project to build something is usually a tiny fraction of the total life cycle of that product and the total cost we're going to spend to maintain it over that life cycle. To use an example from my own career history, one of the first software systems I ever worked on was a product called Supply Management and Resource Tracking, which is a green screen, micro-focused COBOL system that was built originally in 1984 and is still being used to run the supply chain for the hospital company that I used to work for and by hundreds of thousands of people on behalf of millions of patients. This system probably was pushed to market in about a year, and people scrambled to get it done, and they said, we have to cut corners because we got to get this thing out the door, and the CIO is pissed at us. And we have been paying for that for decades after that. And I'm sure if you think about systems that are used in finance, I mean, just yesterday, Delta, the airline in the US, had an outage of their systems, which I'm almost sure was caused by exactly this sort of thing, where they've got, a hairball of systems in the back end that were built years ago. So think about those two things in conjunction. So if I'm building features and a very high proportion of those features are rarely or never used, and in building those features, I'm cutting corners because I have to rush them out the door. And then I have to maintain those features that are getting rarely or never used. Building on the technical debt that I did during the project, think about how much of our effort in an IT organization is going towards basically handling the sins of the past for things we shouldn't have built. Pretty bad. Economically, it's really, really bad. Part of the reason we make these mistakes about technical debt and extra features, we have these delays and we have too much work in process, is that organizations that are built for high resource utilization face a really big problem with handoffs, right? So if you think about a world where I'm working on a single project, I'm doing software development on a single thing. If I'm getting into do development, there's an amount of time that I have to spend researching and understanding the problem and understanding that part of the code base and getting environments set up and getting in the zone and coding that and getting going. And then when I stop, I have to tie things off. I have to make sure that I have tests in place properly to make sure that things going to work when I leave. I got to comment properly. I got to check things back in. I got to tear down environments, all those kinds of things. If I'm working on one project, you can already see I'm wasting a fair amount of my time in setup and teardown. It's a necessary evil. If I'm working on multiple projects, I'm doing that constantly. A higher and higher proportion of my time is going not to the work, but to the wasteful activity of setup and teardown. That's thinking sort of handoffs between projects and the task switching that I'm doing myself, between me and myself. There's also handoffs, there's also task switching between people within the project. Did any of you guys ever play the telephone game in summer camp? That idea of whispering in somebody's ear and they whisper in the next person's ear and they whisper in the next person's ear, about 20 people down the line. It's hilarious, but it no longer matches what the first person said. I mean, that's the way most projects work. And it's really worse because it's not just passing along a word, it's passing along ideas, and it's ideas for something new we've never done before. So if you think about this, think about the typical project in IT. Somebody in the business has an idea for a new business thing, which they've never done before. It's an idea. It's an experiment that they're going to try. And they think in order to do this new business thing, they're going to need some system stuff. So they try to explain carefully to a business analyst what they think they might need next year to support the project they think they're going to do. And the BA hears it, and they don't have the full context, but they think they kind of generally understand it. And so they try to write that down, but the guy's talking really fast, and so I don't get all of it. And I don't really capture it perfectly. And he doesn't actually say all the things that he means to say. Some of them are just still in his head. And then I pass that to a designer who thinks they understand what I'm trying to describe, but there's a lot of words here. And so they don't design it all. And along the way, there's some gold plating that they might want to add into it. And they hand that to a developer who doesn't actually read the documentation anyway, and they just get going and build the thing. And they hand it to a tester who doesn't actually understand the context, so they don't actually test the things that matter because they don't actually understand what matters. And then that's handed back out to a customer who's not necessarily the same customer because people have shifted along the way. And the person who gets it says, well, I don't know why they said they needed this thing. I don't actually think we need this thing. That's really not important. Oh yeah, that was like 6 months ago. Things have changed. A competitor came out with something different. That doesn't really matter a lot. So if you think about a world of this imperfect information and these handoffs and this information loss and this switching between projects that we're constantly doing, is it any wonder that we build the wrong things and we build it poorly? And that results in defects. There's other reasons for defects as well. Lean, when it thinks about defects, thinks about it differently maybe than other people do. And that is an idea that when we test, what we should be aiming to do is test the process, not the product. Now, we use the product as a proxy for the process. But what we're trying to do is not just find and fix errors. What we're trying to do is find and fix the problems in our process that allow those errors to happen in the first place. We're trying to error-proof our process via testing. To give you a very specific example of that, of a company that I've worked with, Rolls-Royce, Aero Engines, a company where quality matters a whole lot, obviously, because otherwise planes fall out of the sky. They don't test every unit that comes off their assembly line. What they do is when they do a new design or a new product line, they test intensively to find problems in the production process. And they establish a range of tolerance within which, as long as things stay in that and they can see that easily in automated testing in the production process, they don't have to test. And what they look for is things that go outside of the range of tolerance. And when that happens, they crash halt the production process and they go in and find out what's wrong with the process. They don't just fix the fan blades or whatever else it might be. So it's focusing on failure proofing rather than failure identification and fixing. Lean believes, you can sort of see that in the testing process, that knowledge, any knowledge that's really useful for new and innovative things, comes by doing, not by researching. Now, that's not to say that researching the available knowledge on the shelf isn't useful. You've got to have a good basis for knowledge. But most things that you're going to do that are truly valuable are new, which means you are creating knowledge through the process of doing. So we really, until we do, we have a hypothesis. We don't actually know until we try. And the truth is we really, really don't know until our customers have tried, they have experienced it, they have been willing to part with some of their hard-earned money for it, and ideally, they've actually renewed for a follow-on purchase. That's giving us the full cycle of learning in terms of what's working and what's not. So what we have at the beginning is an idea, and we want to be moving as quickly as possible in our processes to where we're creating knowledge by doing. And once we do that, we have to understand that a lot of that knowledge that we're gaining is implicit in the team. It's implicit in the people, it's in the product. And while documentation is good and valuable and you've absolutely got to have it, we cannot fool ourselves that everything we know can be put in documentation. A lot of the knowledge is inherent in the team, and that's why Lean very much focuses on the idea of stable teams that stay together for a long time. In the Lean world, we talk about that as work cells, because people, there's not just the knowledge in the people, there's the knowledge in the group that we've created. On the other hand, Lean talks a lot about waiting to make commitments. So how does that work? If I'm trying to rush to create knowledge, how can I wait to make commitments? Well, the idea here is that there's certain things we're doing which are very mutable, which are easy to change. And there's other things that we're doing which are very, very difficult to change once we've set ourselves down the path. So, if you think about this thing, once I've made a commitment to a tool stack, very hard to change that later. Things in the UI, very, very easy to change continually. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to plan our work such that we front load the things that are easy to change, that gain us a lot of knowledge, and build our products in such a way that we defer our decisions about the hard to change things until as late as possible, until we're very sure that we have something that's going to be relatively fixed and permanent. Now, the funny thing about this is going to create waste at the team level, because that's what it means is we're going to do things which we are later going to tear out and throw away. And what we have to understand is the difference between sub-optimization of reducing waste at the team level versus the level of waste at the organizational level, if you think about that sort of product lifecycle cost sense. So one of the really nice things about the world of cloud these days is that decisions which used to be very hard to change around infrastructure and hardware because there were long lead times around equipment are now things that we can wait and change our minds about until the very last minute in many cases, because you can put in your credit card and get more compute. There are times you can't do that. There are times where you can't iterate your way to something because iteration takes time, and sometimes you don't have time. You actually, there are people in the Agile world who will say you shouldn't have schedules. We should just iterate our way towards happiness. Well, sometimes there are real world deadlines that have real financial implications, serious ones that are live or die for companies. I actually heard on the train, I was sitting next to some guys who must be in a marketing department for I have no idea what. But they were talking about a marketing campaign that was coming out for the summer, which had not yet come out. So there's an example of something where a marketing campaign that's supposed to be for a summer product that doesn't come out before or at the very beginning of summer has a hard fixed deadline. You can't iterate your way past that. They've lost a month's worth of money that they will never, ever get back. To give so that's sort of small scale web dev. People say, well, yeah, that can't apply for big things. So I used to work for a hospital company. Hospital companies have got systems which are called electronic medical records, which are in essence the equivalent of sort of an SAP or an Oracle kind of ERP system, but for a healthcare company. The product that we used was one called Meditech. And that company, HCA, had been using Meditech for 30 years. It's in use by hundreds of thousands of people. This is a big, big, big system. There was a requirement by the US government to add capabilities which were not available in the generation of Meditech that company, that HCA was on. It was only available in an entirely new product version with a different back end. So a major change. I mean, this requirement was tied to, this requirement was tied to serious financial carrots and sticks. So basically, the company was going to be paid extra by the government for patients that it treated if it got this done soon, and it was going to be paid less for patients that the government paid for if it got done late. And the value here was roughly $1 billion a year for each year that they would miss this deadline. So this is big, big money for time, but you're also talking about a product decision which is replacing a system that you've used for 30 years, right? So the typical way to do this would have been, okay, I've got to go fast. I've got this incumbent player. We're going to do a conference room pilot. We'll put out an RFP to other players, but just so that we've got a financial, case where we can use to beat up on our preferred vendor, and we'll just move forward with the new version of the product. It's the typical way to do this because time is money, and we just don't have time. Instead, because we had started doing lean, we started talking about Agile pretty extensively. What the company chose to do was actually implement 4 different types of products in different hospitals in their system and run each of them for more than a year in parallel, so that when it was actually time to down select to the final product that was going to get used, it was based not on a conference room pilot, but was based on real experience. So this was wasting money in the short term so that we could actually hit a real financial deadline while not making a terrible design decision that was going to hurt us for the next 30 years. So, really genuinely, probably tens of millions of extra dollars were spent over the course of a year or so in order to save hundreds of millions of dollars over the course of the next several decades. And it worked. And in the end, what they actually decided to do was use 2 systems, because what they discovered was different size categories of hospitals, it made sense to use different products, and they had realized that homogeneity actually wasn't as valuable as they thought they had done. So this is, I hope you can see as an example of truly big, large-scale stuff that's not just iterative web development, that these ideas can work for really, really well. Delivering fast. Good. We should all do it as much as we possibly can. One of the knocks that lean gets is that idea I talked about, that eliminating waste means redundancies. This came out of manufacturing, so it must be mechanistic, industrial age, Henry Ford, all kinds of assembly line stuff. It just ain't true. If you look at the best lean companies out there, certainly Toyota or Southwest, or there's lots of examples of this. Ford has done tremendous work in this in the last decade. These are companies that push authority as low as they possibly can in the organization, because what they recognize is most of the good ideas in a company come from the people who are doing the work because they understand it. And this has always been important, But for people like us who work in relatively high labor cost places like England and the United States, in a world of China and India, things that are high volume and inexpensive, there's not much margin in them, and therefore there's not good wages in them, and there's not lots of jobs in them. The things that have a lot of value that can pay for people and good standards of living are things that are innovative. And innovation, despite the Steve Jobs model, does not come out of the head of one genius who just commands and controls the rest of a company to do things. Most companies that do innovation well do it by harnessing all of the brains in the company. So lean is very much about truly respecting people. Does that always mean sort of hugging people and just soft soaping things and being friendly and happy and cheerful and sort of Silicon Valley, everything is awesome? No, it doesn't. Sometimes respecting people means hard conversations, but it means believing that everybody in an organization has something to contribute. And that really means everybody in the organization. So sort of connecting back here to where we started with eliminating waste, lean works on the idea of value streams and the idea that work is not just about work within one team. Anything of significant value within a company is going to be a series of handoffs in interrelationships and dependencies between different teams. And you have to understand that flow of value through teams in order to understand where waste elimination, where focus on quality, where these critical commitments that we need to defer are. We can't be sub-optimizing at the team level. We've got to understand our value stream and focus our process improvement efforts where it's really, really going to matter, not just sort of scattershot, again, like a Six Sigma kind of a thing, like, hey, everybody's going to cut 15% of waste out of their process. Sometimes waste in one part of your organization is slack capacity that other parts of your organization desperately need in order to maintain throughput. So in terms of lean, I've got a little bit more I'm going to talk about here about sort of specifics of Kanban and Scrum to tie them back to these things. But in terms of lean, if you're going out, you want to learn more about these things. Some suggested reading here. And I sort of put this in order. The first one is Jim Womack and Dan Jones's Lean Thinking, which is kind of the seminal work of this from the 90s, which is really crucial to understanding about how this works across different industries. If you work in the world of corporate IT, I would strongly recommend, matter of fact, I would just come out and tell you you're wrong if you don't read The Phoenix Project. This is a fabulous book that will help you understand how IT really works in companies. It and this next book down are in essence paraphrases of the book at the bottom, which is The Goal by Ellie Goldratt, which was written back in the 80s about a manufacturing company. I would really suggest to you, if you're wanting to truly get good at this and understand it at sort of a gut instinctive level, not just at a surface level, read, again, especially if you're in the IT world. If you're in the world of engineering, there's another book called Velocity. So if you work around physical stuff, also tied to knowledge work stuff, Velocity is going to be a really good book. But read one of these now, and then come back in a year and read The Goal, and you will learn new stuff. It's the same stuff, but from a different direction, and it will really help you understand how this stuff works. All right, so flipping forward from sort of the general principles to the specifics of methodologies, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. This is not a deep talk about either Scrum or Kanban, but what I want to do is I want to talk to you about the idea of speaking about these things as verses is to fundamentally misunderstand what they are completely, and to buy into people who are trying to sell you something, basically. And since I don't sell methodology, I can tell you that without losing any methodology business. So this is Kanban. For those of you who don't know, Kanban is a bit more than sticky notes on a whiteboard. So these are the 6 fundamental principles that or practices that we talk about within the world of Kanban to do things effectively. So Kanban is about visualizing what you do now. Not what you should be doing, not what you wish you were doing, what you are doing now. Visualizing it. It's about limiting work in progress. Like I talked about before, work in progress is a bad thing. We want to have less of it because if we do, we will get more done faster, better. We're trying to manage for smooth flow. We're trying to eliminate that waste of Muri and variability. So visualize it, reduce it, aim for smooth flow, evolve our processes. Because often when we first visualize processes, there's a lot of assumptions baked in that we don't visualize it first, or relying on people to go back to manuals for what they're supposed to do. If they were at the training, they would know what to do. You're trying to make something where the visualized process encompasses everything that somebody needs to do their job well. The rules about how to do the right thing are in the place where the person does their work, not on a shelf. We're trying to implement feedback loops because Kanban is all about change, continuous improvement, that virtuous cycle of lean. That's really what we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to improve collaboratively using the Kanban in order to apply these new methods, which very often is lean. So this is, if you think about this, Kanban is, at some level, it's not a thing, it's a technique for improving something else. And that something else can be very different in different worlds. This can be applied for somebody who's doing the waterfall, for somebody who's doing Scrum, for somebody who's writing telenovelas in Brazil. These things pretty much apply to anybody. Do I need to talk you guys through the Scrum framework, or are we pretty good with that? Anybody who wants to volunteer and say they don't understand Scrum that well? No, you guys all good. Would you agree that what Scrum does is about establishing new roles, a set of rituals for how an organization is run, and a cadence for the team? That's what the Scrum Guide is fundamentally about. All right. So if you compare those two things, so Scrum is this structure, a specific structure for doing particular things. It doesn't say anything, and there's a new version of the Scrum Guide, and I still think it doesn't say anything about these things. It says nothing about not visualizing. Scrum is definitely actually about WIP limitation. It's just not at the sequential process step. It's at the batch for what you pull into a sprint. And certainly you measure flow. You do it using velocity. Now in the world of lean, we would say velocity properly understood is throughput, and we want to measure cycle time and some other things. But certainly Scrum says to measure velocity, which is a flow measurement. And my experience is that most teams that get really good at doing Scrum, I was talking with somebody about the video game development world. There's a lot of people in the video game development world that will describe themselves as doing Scrum. That's also the part of the world where Kanban first took root at very large scale, because in essence those teams had evolved their way from Scrum into Kanban. Sometimes they abandoned the term Scrum, sometimes they didn't, but it was an evolution. It wasn't like, oh, this doesn't work. It was a gradual changing from mature Scrum into something that was quite Kanban-ish. Very, very common pattern. The other thing, so looking at Kanban from the other direction, Kanban is about evolution through measurement. It has absolutely no opinion whatsoever about roles, meetings, iterations, any of those kinds of things. Now, people in the software development world who are doing Kanban will often continue to use practices from Scrum around daily stand-ups and retrospectives and all these kinds of things because they make sense in the context. But you definitely see that Kanban teams in software development will almost always be quite Scrummy. And so if you were looking at people who would say they're doing Scrum or say they're doing Kanban and you didn't have the labels, you just walked in and asked them to describe their processes if they're doing it well, you would end up with something that looks very, very similar. It's not always going to be true in Kanban for something like IT ops or for engineering or for marketing, but in the software development space, very much going to be true. So I think it's really important that when we look at these things, we don't look at it as a sort of a fight between frameworks or a choice of frameworks. What we should be looking at is, A, the principles that I already talked about. Why are we doing this? What are we trying to accomplish? And then saying, okay, what is the best set of practices that I can apply within my context to be as effective as I possibly can. And again, in software development, I think you're going to find that both of these things are going to mesh really well. If you're new to Kanban, we have a ebook that's available called the Kanban Roadmap, which is available out on our website, along with lots of articles, other ebooks, webinars, board templates, case studies, all kinds of stuff that is absolutely free. So, you know, whether you're interested in LeanKit as a product or not, all kinds of, you know, if you're going to continue to be a valued customer of 3M and just buy sticky notes, that's totally cool. We are too. But please use the heck out of the stuff that's available on our website. To go beyond that in terms of learning specifically about Kanban, David Anderson's blue book on Kanban, Jim Benson, Antonien de Maria Berry's personal Kanban, Matthias Skarin, Heinrich Nyberg, and if you really want to understand the maths of this stuff, because you're not just going to take my word for the fact that these curves that look pretty are true, Don Reinertson's Principles of Product Development Flow is absolutely the essential reading for really understanding why this stuff